Hey, folks, from Tucson, Minnesota, San Francisco, Maryland. Oh, there's a good one. Dowagiac, Michigan. I've never even heard of that. Spokane, Washington, one I learned how to pronounce. Grand Junction, Colorado. Hartford, Connecticut. I had a great time in Hartford last year, by the way. Germany from Facebook, so I should stop looking at the different places you've been. Newton, come on, Chestnut Hill, where I is my other foothold, right? Anyway, sorry, as many people are, I've been spending the day running around, so I've totally forgot to send. I knew I was going to do this today, but I totally forgot to send out a list of questions or asking for your questions. You did put enough in the last 5 minutes that this is going to be longer than I expected it to be, but sorry about that. I do want to start with a couple of announcements. The first one is, yes, there are a number of deep fakes of me on YouTube. And YouTube in the past has been very good about taking those down. We're having quite a bit of trouble getting at least one of them taken down in the last couple of days. So if it looks funny to you, it is. I only have one official channel. This is the one that many of you are on right now. Anything else that purports to be by me is going to be a deep fake, unless it is me being interviewed by somebody whose name you will recognize. So, there's stuff out with me and Paul Krugman, for example, Gil Duran, lots of interviews that I do. Those will be on my channel as well. So if you want to hear from me, go to my channel. And if you see something else come up, especially one that's fed to you, what they're really trying to do is use my likeness to sell stuff. And that means that they've been putting out some real right-wing stuff and so on. There's actually a couple of them out there that are quite interesting. One in which I actually appear to have some sense of clothing, which amuses me to no end, because if you watch me, I just don't care about clothing at all. But there's also another one that I've got giant eyes, which kind of amuses me. I look like one of those little fur baby dolls, and I can't believe anybody thought I actually looked like that. But if you see those, please report them and put in the comments that it's not me, because at least one of them is spouting some really bonkers stuff. All right, so that's one of my announcements. The other is the Visibility Brigade has asked me to urge people to go to their website to look at Operation Fortify. That is the Visibility Brigade. They are the ones who do the signage over roadways, and they're a good group to be involved with, as is the CARD campaign, which has been doing great work now for a couple of years. I think time certainly seems to be flying by. And, we're coming into a really important session in American history in the next, 10 months before the next election. And all of these people are going to need to be fortified. They're going to need to be worked with, and so on. So keep that in the back of your mind. Okay, so you had a bunch of questions today. But I'm going to start in a little bit of a different place than you expected me to start, I think. And that is with an article in the Washington Post today that said something we all knew anyway, but they actually chased down the facts and the stories for real. And that is the article in the Washington Post, as I say, establishes that the Department of Homeland Security, and especially within it, ICE, has been quite deliberately using their arrests of people living in America. And again, there are some U.S. citizens in that. There are people who are legally here, as well as undocumented immigrants. But they have been deliberately using those as almost a film series. There is this attempt constantly on the part of the White House to every day release, and boy, was that a split infinitive, sorry about that, to release every day a video that draws eyeballs. And they draw eyeballs by using material illegally, like ripping off somebody's songs, by having something look like really dangerous, something to make you afraid, like just being so offensive that they can assume that people will share things, like, for example, the many ways in which the Department of Homeland Security has in the last week used the image of Santa Claus as an evil image, recognizing that people would respond to that by going, oh, isn't this awful, and sharing it. And that idea of always staying in people's eyes has been central to Donald Trump's entire political career, and before that, his real estate career and his career on television. But it is very much a part of this second term, where they're just constantly, as one person said to a reporter, White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles has essentially been running a reality show out of the Oval Office. And so we have now this article that talks about the ways in which the administration keeps repeating the idea that they're arresting the worst of the worst, even though we know that that's not true, that significant numbers, well over half of the people, and it might be more than that, I actually don't have the numbers in front of me right now, who have been swept up in these raids have not ever been charged with a crime or convicted of a crime in the United States. And people put that, by the way, you put that caveat there, not because they have been elsewhere, but because reporters haven't been able to check records elsewhere that are often hard to access and kept in languages that the reporters don't speak. So when they use that warning and say, well, not in the United States, it doesn't mean that they're not telling you about other ones. It means that they didn't have access to that and they don't want to say something that isn't true, unlike what the White House is doing. So there is this sense of creating a television presidency. And that's increasingly showing up as a key moment in all of American history, where essentially we have a television president who is trying to project a certain kind of role of strength in the society and is trying constantly to have our eyeballs. And what he has done is he has taken 2 generations, really, of rhetoric from the American right that talks about strength being violence, strength being individualism, strength being ordering other people around and treating women and people of color and Black Americans as subordinates. And he is really taking that to an almost cartoonish level on the screen. And there is, of course, a goal behind this. The Republican Party embraced that ideology or that rhetoric in the 1980s, picking it up from the right before that in the 70s, the 60s, and the 50s. And they picked it up from Reconstruction before them. But the original idea of the Republican Party in its modern incarnation was that this idea of individual strength was a way to attack the federal government, the idea that you needed the federal government to do things like provide a basic social safety net or regulate business or promote infrastructure or protect civil rights or underpin on a global international rules-based order. And they embrace that idea, that vision, that sort of cowboy individualism. Think of Reagan and that fabulous picture of Reagan in the cowboy hat. Reagan himself was a very, very good horseman, but he wrote in the English style until he decided to go for American politics, when then he began to ride in the American style. And you saw them doing this with the idea of cutting back the federal government in such a way that it would enable a very few Americans to concentrate wealth and to concentrate power. And that's exactly what we got. Now, in this moment, Trump is doing it, I think, for a different reason. He has embraced that idea. But one of the things that his constant television presidency has done is it's made it easier to get rid of the rules and regulations and the institutions that keep people like him from amassing a whole lot of money. There is some level at which this presidency is just one big grift. And you can see that from the amount of billions of dollars that he and members of his family have amassed just in the last less than a year since they've been in office. But what you are also starting to see, that was actually a prelude to what I was going to talk about. But what you're also starting to see is reality hitting this, reality coming in and smashing into this vision. And this is really interesting because this is actually what I study and what I care about. And maybe, I'm going to try and do something on Christmas Day, at least record something early, because I know Christmas is a really hard time for a lot of people. And it's nice to keep the world turning in a normal way. And maybe this is what I will talk about, is the ways in which what we imagine structures the world in which we live until reality comes smashing into it. And that's, of course, a very deep theme in American literature, which is what my master's is in. And man, I could talk to you about Portrait of a Lady until I put you to sleep at Christmas. Maybe I'll do that. Anyway, this is really interesting because what people imagine really matters. Like, a lot of historians will say to you, oh, that's just the Western image and no one cares about that. But I don't believe that. I think what we believe really, really matters. It shapes the way we see the world in any number of ways. But there does come a point when reality smashes in and you can't maintain your belief in that fantasy any longer. And honestly, when I think about it too hard, I think about the Garden of Eden and the concept of the Garden of Eden, which is a paradise, right? Until the people who live there begin to understand the world. They get knowledge. And then it's not a paradise anymore. They have lost that paradise. And if you think about the fantasies that somebody has, a child or somebody has about their life, like when that fantasy falls apart, things are pretty grim. And when you think about the Trump administration right now, that grim reality is really starting to smash home. So there was another story out today that somebody asked me to talk about, and that was also in the Washington Post. And that was, and by the way, normally I would have at the tip of my fingers all the journalists and all that, and I don't today because I actually took the day with a friend, which I don't know the last time that happened. So I just skimmed the news. I didn't read it the way I normally do. So I can't tell you who wrote the articles that I'm going to talk about, although I did read them. The other one that I want to mention is a review of the Department of Government Efficiency, which was an agency that really probably did not look legal to people like me, that Trump established as soon as his second term began, and which he put billionaire Elon Musk in charge of. And that was all very, very murky. There's actually somebody on social media who keeps a running thing saying, who's in charge of Doge? Who's in charge of Doge? Because sometimes it was some person, sometimes it was someone else. And they would go to the courts and say it wasn't somebody else. And then Trump would say, oh, yes, it is Musk. And it's one of those areas in which the administration has quite deliberately tried to make sure people can't pin down who's making what decisions. And this is why you've got a number of judges running around saying, you need to tell me who is the person responsible for this. And that keeps changing in a number of cases that I'm not going to talk about today. But there was an article in the Washington Post about that Department of Government Efficiency. And if you remember when they came smashing in less than a year ago, but it feels like forever, their argument was that they had to slash the government because the government was too expensive, and this was how they were going to return the government to the American people. And this is how we got the destruction of the U.S. Agency for International Development, known as USAID or USAID. This is how we got the extraordinary cuts across the board to the Weather Service, to FEMA, to the Federal Emergency Management Agency Administration. I'm sorry, the one or the other. The cuts we had to all sorts of things that got challenged in the courts and so on. But Musk kept doing these things and insisting, oh, I'm saving this many millions, I'm saving this many millions, and this is going to be great. Well, they really have run the numbers now. And of course, that's just a complete fantasy. That in fact, although there was utter chaos in the government in those months, in fact, the government spent more money in those months than it did before Musk started cutting. So there's another case where a lot of Americans had this image from 20 years, 40 years of Republican rhetoric that the government was bloated and that it was wasting money and it would be very, very easy to cut. And this was certainly the idea that a number of the Doge operatives had when they were embedded in these agencies. And what they discovered was, in fact, we have been slashing the U.S. government now since 1981, and it was lean to the bone. And more cuts did nothing at all except create absolute havoc and made it so a lot of people didn't get the services that they had earned or that they needed. And that's another place where a lot of people heard, oh, the government's bloated and I'm going to cut stuff from it and it's going to be great. And what they thought in their heads was, they're going to cut things that I don't care about. Because there's so much bloat, there's going to be stuff I don't care about. And what it has turned out to be, of course, is that there isn't a single American who hasn't lost something that they care deeply about. Now, not everybody is admitting it. There are certainly areas of the country where those cuts are happening, but they're not clear yet where the cuts have come from, that voters are not clear yet where the cuts have come from. But that's simply going to get worse going into 2026. There is also this idea of Trump's tariffs, which he insisted were going to do these wonderful things for the United States. He wanted to get back to the time before 1913, which if you pay any attention to sort of long-term right-wing discussions of the U.S. government, they always pick on 1913 as a crucial year. Well, the reason they pick 1913 is because that's the year that Woodrow Wilson, who was in the news recently because somebody jumped all over him as being a terrible president. And now I'm afraid I can't remember who. Ron DeSantis. There we go. Florida's Ron DeSantis talked about what a terrible president Woodrow Wilson is. And like any president, Woodrow Wilson's got a lot of skeletons in his closet, did a lot of harm in many ways, certainly to race relations. But the reason that the right picks on him as being somebody they don't like is because as soon as he was elected, he forced through Congress the Revenue Act of 1913. And the Revenue Act of 1913, and I can already see all your eyes glazing over, but it's actually quite an interesting law and an important law, because what it does is it cuts tariffs. Because the tariffs, as you now know, raise prices for consumers. And around the turn of the last century, the tariffs were high enough that it was hitting everybody. Like tariffs on tin affected tin pails, and tin pails are what people carried their lunches in. And there's actually a tariff on twine and on the jute that makes twine, which again, you're probably thinking, I don't really need twine that much. Well, you did if you were a farmer and you need to bind up your wheat. So those tariffs were like the heart of why, if you remember in high school, you always had these classes about tariffs in the late 19th century. And if you were like me, you were like, who cares? The trick was that tariffs represented the idea that rich people were running the government, and they were putting in place these laws that were driving prices way up for consumers. All of a sudden, that feels pretty right? So I just came from the supermarket, and you can literally look and see the food that is being imported at sky high prices. And then there will be like one article that's not that expensive, and you're like, oh, that's right, he just lowered that tariff, so that's in 1913. Woodrow Wilson lowered the tariff across the board in the 1913. Congress did it, but he pushed them to do it in the Revenue Act of 1913. And to make up the missing revenue, income taxes. That's the reason that the right wing is so furious about the Revenue Act of 1913, because it switched our revenue from relying primarily on tariffs to relying primarily on income taxes. Now, income taxes actually were invented in the United States in 1861. That's a kind of a different story. But Trump was explaining to everybody when he was running for office that he could put tariffs on. He kept saying they're going to be paid by other countries. Complete crap. They're paid by consumers. And that once we can do that, we can get rid of income taxes. That's where he was going with that. And now people are waking up to the fact that it's bloody expensive right now in the United States of America, and it's only going to get worse. At the same time, he insisted that this would bring manufacturing back. And it doesn't, it hasn't, at the same time that he has cut not all, but many of the green energy programs that the Biden administration established, which did provide manufacturing and especially jobs as electricians, union jobs as electricians and union jobs in manufacturing. So you're starting to see all this stuff kind of smash into the vision, the fantasy that he has been selling to us. So what does this mean? There are a number of things in that idea of Trump being strong and projecting this image of strength that we need to grapple with. And one of them you have seen in the news again in the last couple of days, and that is the idea once again that Trump and J.D. Vance, and I'm going to come back to that, are talking about the United States needing to take Greenland. Greenland is an autonomous island that is part of Denmark, and Denmark is an ally. And similarly, there's a ton of pressure that they're putting on Canada. They keep saying that Canada has to become part of the United States. What on earth is going on with that? That was never, ever part of Trump's administration campaign in 24 or before that. And the answer to that is Trump is turning his back on the rules-based international order that the United States and other World War II allies established after World War II, which said that instead of having a world in which big countries can simply take over smaller countries the way that we had, the things that led to World Wars I and II, and certainly wars before that, instead of that, the globe would come up with a series of institutions. And I always talk about the UN and NATO, but there are others as well that are, and CETO and now AUKUS, but there are others as well that establish financial rules. Or so we have. There's actually a banking system that the entire world uses. There, if you're allowed to be in it. Right now, Russia is not, and this is one of the reasons Russia's economy is in such trouble and why they're so anxious to get back into being accepted as part of it. There are all these different systems, and what they do is they say, you can't gang up, a big country can't just take over a smaller country, because then you got other countries that jump in, and then you're back in a war in having to deal with wars. Trump is turning his back on that. That's when he's attacking Europe, which is our, longest ally in this system, when he is focusing on insisting that somehow Europe is becoming less European because it's got immigrants and so on. And instead, he's turning to a system that is embraced by people like Vladimir Putin of Russia, which is the idea that big countries should take over smaller countries and have spheres of influence in which they kind of divide the world up by sphere. And it's pretty clear that the United States under Donald Trump, the administration, is trying to take over North America and South America, turn its back on Europe and other countries around the world and say, this is going to be our world. We're going to take the resources from South America and so on, and this is going to be our world. But that is also a world, a global system that enriches a very few people and takes us back to a world before we had free trade, before we had the things that have made this globe, not just the United States, but this globe advance so dramatically since 1945, in which more than 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's going on here. So that strongman vision that he has basically is, I'm going to turn my back on having a seat at the table of the whole world in which we try and be equals. Try, mind you, we've never done it right, but that's part of the process, right? And instead, I'm going to go back to my little sandbox, and I'm going to rule my little sandbox. And everybody's got to do what I say, and I get all the money and all the goods, which is basically what Vladimir Putin has tried to do in Russia. And that idea of strength, the way that strength works under that system, people like me say it doesn't work that way. And you look at somebody like Vladimir Putin and say, are you really going to exchange the presidency of the United States and the United States with its extraordinary soft power as well as hard power around the world to be a tin pot dictator? And of course, that looks great to Trump because he doesn't care how big the pool is so long as he can be the biggest guy in it. So you see this in the many ways in which he is imitating Vladimir Putin with his name up on the Kennedy Center, he wants to build a triumphal arch. I talked about that the other day and why it upsets people like me so much. But then you also saw it in his recall in the last day or so of ambassadors, of some of our key ambassadors around the world, recalling them, saying America doesn't care about you anymore. We're recalling our ambassadors. And that is, again, an image, he's got this image that he's trying to portray that is leading us to this very small, very dangerous, very poor place. Now, it's not a done deal. And this is, I'm trying, it's kind of a game for me to see if I can work in your questions. A lot of you asked what's happening at the Heritage Foundation. And that's, again, really interesting. So the Heritage Foundation is begun in the late 70s, I think it is. It becomes really the mouthpiece for the Reagan administration and becomes the voice for the modern Republican Party, modern being the 1980s. And a lot of that is those people believe in free trade. They believe that this is a better system than the isolationist system from before before World War II. They believe in a strong military around the world, which often, not always, but often imposes the will of the United States on other countries, which is where a number of people really split from the ideas of those people. I'm one of them. I don't think that's the way the American military should use its might, but that's one of the things they believed. And they believed in a small government because they didn't want business regulation primarily, and they didn't want taxes. But they also, some of the true believers actually believed that a government should stay out of your business, which is how you ended up with people like Mitt Romney's family supporting, and George W. Bush's family being some of those who began to support Planned Parenthood in its early days. Get the government out of our families. They don't belong. The government doesn't belong in our families. Those people, Heritage then got taken over about 2 years ago by Kevin Roberts, and he is a MAGA. He is a Trump guy. And if you think about what's happened to the Republican Party since Trump took it over, it's basically tossed overboard everything I just said. It has tossed overboard the idea of the government of free trade, and now Trump is trying to use his tariffs to impose American will on, especially on North and South America, but on other parts of the world as well. It has thrown over the idea of American involvement around the world in favor of a kind of isolationism that really makes us completely pulls us away from the table in truly heartbreaking ways. I haven't written about it yet, but Mother Jones has just a couple of heart-wrenching examinations of what happened, especially in places like Kenya, with the end of U.S. aid, and people literally having to pick which child gets to eat. Just really, truly horrific stuff. And then at the same time, the MAGAs have also walked away from the idea of keeping the government at bay from individuals, and they want to use a strong government to enforce their will on the American people. So one of the things that has happened is you're seeing a dramatic split now in the Republican Party between MAGA people, the people who are going to follow Trump, and they have begun to slide even farther right. So you can see people like Vice President J.D. Vance, who is the heir apparent to Trump, but that's not clear yet. Obviously, if something happens to Trump in the next 3 years, he will step up. But he has very little charisma, and he is not popular. He doesn't have a base of his own right now. Anyway, he's reaching for it by working with Erica Kirk, who is the widow of Charlie Kirk, and they had their America Fest, Turning Point USA at its America Fest last weekend, and Erica Kirk said she will be supporting J.D. Vance for president in 2028, and he has embraced those young Republicans who were Nazi adjacent and admiring Adolf Hitler and so on. Remember, he said, oh, they're just kids. And he has really moved right with that sort of younger MAGA group that is moving right toward people like Nick Fuentes, who's the guy who supports the Groypers, or who invented the Groypers, who were far to the right of Charlie Kirk and who harassed Charlie Kirk all the time at his events. So that part of MAGA is really moving rightward. And what that's done is it's opened up some space on the right for figures who are still on the right. Don't, you know, they're a lot of people are calling them moderates. They are not moderates. They are still far right. But they're saying we're not going down the neo-Nazi road. And that's going to be people like Mike Pence. Now, Mike Pence had his own personal issues with MAGA because, I don't know, they tried to hang him, but or at least they called for his hanging. But he immediately after the Trump left office and he left office, he began his own think tank. And that think tank is still an evangelical Christian think tank. They're still as Christian as anybody else is. But they called for free trade, for American intervention in the world, and for the government to stay out of business, for example, which Trump has done. He's got the government actually taking pieces of American business, which is mind-boggling. I mean, that's the kind of thing that the Republican Party in the 1950s was like, you know, this is communism and so on. And now Trump is saying, sure, why not? And MAGA seems to be going along with it. They don't want that. They're moving away from that. So Heritage, when it embraced Tucker Carlson after he did a glowing interview with Nick Fuentes, the far-right guy, that was a big problem because the Heritage president, who's a Trumper, Kevin Roberts, supported that. And when that happened, the Heritage guys started leaving. And they had been there much longer than Roberts had. He's only been there about 2 years. Roberts is one of the key authors of Project 2025, by the way. And they have jumped ship now. Many of them have jumped ship to go to Mike Pence's organization. And that's, you know, part of you sits there and says, who cares? Like, this is 30 people who are saying stuff you're never going to read. I'll probably read it. But there's a dramatic split in the Republican Party right now. And it matters not only for 2026, but remember, Trump put enormous pressure on Indiana to redistrict the state to make sure that the Republicans would take all of the seats in the House of Representatives. And the Indiana Senate said no. A majority of the Republican senators in the Indiana Senate said no. And in the House in Indiana, they said yes. But the Indiana senators said, take a hike. And that's not an accident. Pence is from Indiana. So there is this building sense that they are splitting. And, you know, there's rumors this week that Ted Cruz is intending to run or thinking about running as an anti-Trumper. I'll believe that when I see it. But so there's this split. Now, one of the things about that split, and I'm going to come back now to the idea that there is this reality smashing in, is the first thing that you asked about that at this point you probably think I'm never going to get to, and that's the Epstein files. The Epstein files are weirdly big in American history, not just in this moment. Of course, they're big in this moment, but they got a huge amount of traction in part because QAnon formed in the 20 teens, 20 teens, around the idea that there was an elite group, an international elite group of pedophiles that was raping children and often drinking their blood. That was part of it. And which is kind of interesting sort of in terms of historical patterns. Often when you get an elite in a society, there are stories about them eating or abusing children. I could actually make a list for you here in the United States, and maybe someday I'll write about it. But when you start to think they've got everything, they're taking everything, it's only a question of time till you start to think they're also abusing children. That's sort of the most heinous thing most people can think of. Well, QAnon formed around this, and Trump and his henchmen tapped into that. People like Steve Bannon and Mike Flynn tapped into that. And what became the story was that Jeffrey Epstein had been part of this. And Jeffrey Epstein, who was in fact, no longer present tense, raping children and just he's a convicted sex offender and so on. He became like this. They really fed this idea that there was this story out there about him that was going to bring down Democrats. And now, thanks to a single reporter, by the way, I believe at the Miami Herald, who would not let the story go, the Epstein story is breaking open. And as it is breaking open, it is clear now, for example, that Steve Bannon was a good friend of Jeffrey Epstein, but that also a lot of the people that the MAGA thought were going to protect the children that were vulnerable to this international sex ring were in fact participating in it. So what we are seeing now was Congress pretty much overwhelmingly said to Donald Trump, first through a discharge petition. You remember Mike Johnson, this House Speaker, was trying to protect him from having the Congress say you got to release this stuff. But they Republicans and Democrats together worked with a discharge petition to force a vote on whether or not the Department of Justice had to release the FBI's files in which they looked at the Epstein issue, or the potential crimes created around Epstein. That's different than the Epstein estate. Okay, you got to keep those two things separate, because the Epstein estate stuff has been coming out for a while now. Now what we're seeing is the government, by law, by the 19th of December, was supposed to release all the Epstein files, and they are not doing it. They are breaking the law. Quite obviously breaking the law. And they have, by the way, been quite obviously breaking the law in a number of different ways that people weren't paying attention to. The Impoundment Act, for example, the World War Powers Act. But in this case, there is explicitly a law, and they are explicitly breaking it, which has opened up the conversation about impeachment. Because, there are a lot of things that Trump does that are against the Constitution, for example, the Emoluments Clause. But it's not like there's a law that says, if you do this, you have to do this, like for the Emoluments Clause. In this case, the law is pretty clear, and they are breaking it. So people are seeing in real time profoundly disturbing material coming out about the president. And this is only what they've let get out so far. There are hundreds of thousands of files out there, and they've released a little over 10,000 of them. And many of those are redacted, and they're being released selectively. So a number of the first tranche of documents seem to implicate Bill Clinton, former President Bill Clinton. He came out and said, "I'm demanding that you release everything that has my name on it," which really called their bluff. I mean, he's assuming, I guess, that he knows that he's not going to be in real trouble according to what comes out. That's itself a rabbit hole that I can't really go into now, which is an interesting one. But one of the things you should know about these Epstein files is everything that comes out, you should take with more than a grain of salt. You should take it with the whole salt shaker, because if they have hundreds of thousands of files, what they've got is tips, rumors, ideas, hard fact as well. But they're going to try and release the crap to muddy the waters. So there's something came out this morning or late last night that may or may not be true. I don't know. But anytime you see something crazy sensational, it's always worth taking a breath and waiting a little bit, because they're not going to be deliberately giving us the things that we want to see. They're going to be trying to set this up in such a way that they can then say, see, it was all crap all the time, which is precisely what you saw over the Steele dossier. If you remember that, and I'm not going to do the whole history of the Steele dossier. That was, again, raw intelligence. And the thing about raw intelligence is it's raw intelligence. Some of it is good, some of it is bad. And that when you look at it and you take the worst part of it and say, see, we told you it wasn't true, you discount all the stuff that was true. And so what you're going to see is a lot of this muddying the waters. The muddying the waters does not mean that everything in this file is bad. It means they're showing you the crap. And that, again, take a deep breath, no matter what comes out, and wait to see what gets corroborated. But there's an awful lot of stuff that has already been corroborated that's bad, really bad. So when you get, many of you know to what I'm alluding, when you get something like that, to me, it's so bad that you're like, I don't know. Maybe not. We don't know. But we've seen a lot of that lately, where stuff gets out there and then it disappears. You don't know what happens to it. The story changes. Take a deep breath about that. But all that to say that the Epstein files are not going away. They are not going away. More and more people are interested. Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon is digging into the finances. He's had some great work on that. This is not going away. And what it's going to do is expose not only serious players in the American political system, but also in the business, academia, all the other fields that indicate that there was this group of people who felt that they couldn't, and this is the key point of here, that felt they could do anything without any repercussions. And well, many of weirdly, two of my best friends, I shouldn't say weirdly, because one of them might be listening. Two of my best friends are scholars of ancient Greece and Rome, which seems a little random, I have to say, because we met in very different ways. But when we talk about this, they talk about the untouchability of certain leaders in those societies. I look at the elite slave owners in the American South who could do whatever they wanted, and they just were almost never called up on it. And that feels like what we're going to see from that. Another moment where people's fantasy about Trump is going to protect these children turns into, crap, he was protecting the people who were attacking the children. So there's that. There is also more and more coming out about these deportations or renditions. Remember, deportations are when somebody gets taken from one country back to the country they came from. Renditions are when they are taken to a third country. And many of the things that this Department of Homeland Security has done is it's taken people to a third country, then for deportation back to a country where the United States said they couldn't be sent because they were in danger of torture or death. The story that Barry Weiss of CBS spiked on Sunday was a look inside the CCOT prison, which is the terrorist prison in El Salvador, to which 242, I think it is, men have been sent, including Kilmar Abrego Garcia, and where they were tortured. And that story and what happened to those people, again, the Trump administration keeps saying they're the worst of the worst, but in fact, they were never tried. They were never accused. Many of them were never accused of anything in the U.S., were never tried, were never sentenced, and certainly were not sentenced to go to a prison where they were going to be tortured. People are starting to be aware of that. And again, Barry Weiss killing that was just about the worst thing she could have done in terms of making sure people saw it, because she tried to spike it here in the U.S., but it had already been sent to Canada. Canada showed it. It's come back over the border. Thank you, Canada, by the way. So people are starting to see that. And there is also, I think, enough of a backlash to Trump that you're seeing quite dramatic stuff happening. And where I'm going with that now is that today, the United States Supreme Court sided against Trump on whether or not he could deploy federalized National Guard troops in Chicago. And they did that despite the fact that they have been siding with him overwhelmingly. The lower courts have been siding against him overwhelmingly, even his own appointees. The Supreme Court has been siding for him. So in this, a lot of people were surprised. And they said something really interesting that I want to dig into just a little bit. And that is, they said that he could not override the Posse Comitatus Act. And you've heard me talk about Posse Comitatus before, and I will write a whole letter on the Posse Comitatus because I know it really well for a little bit of a bizarre reason, but I will tell you some stuff about it. And that's that the Posse Comitatus Act covers the United States Army, but other branches of the military have adopted it since Congress passed it in 1878. The one group that has not adopted Posse Comitatus is the Department of Homeland Security. And in part, we don't want them to adopt it. In part, they should, but in part, we don't want them for the simple fact of the matter that is the Coast Guard is in the Department of Homeland Security. And we need our coasties to be able to enforce the law. Because what the Posse Comitatus Act says is that the U.S. government cannot use the military against its own citizens. It's actually how we got the National Guard, because the idea was that the National Guard troops would be less likely, if they were state-based, to turn their guns on people in their states. How do we get that law? It's the story of how we got it and why we got it is really important, because most people misunderstand this. What happens is that, and I'll give you the short version, what happens is that in 1876, there is a real fight about who got elected president. You know this, Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel Tilden. Looks like Samuel Tilden gets the most votes. He's the Democrat. He's a reformer from New York City. But there are 4 states. Everyone thinks there's 3 because one's in the far west. But there are 4 states where there's a fight over which set of electors should be counted in. And this is, by the way, corrected later on, and why there should never be that happening again. As it came up in the election of 2020. But so there's a big fight over these electors, and nobody knows what the hell to do. And they have just finished with the Civil War in 1865. So this is only 12 years later. And here you've got what looks to be 2 groups of people trying to steal the election. Pretty clear that Tilden won the most votes, but at the same time, it's also clear that in the American South, Black Americans were prevented from voting. Black American men could vote, and the white Democrats simply kept them away from the polls by doing things like having shooting matches right beside the polls. They did all kinds of stuff. It was a terrible election. So was 74, by the way. I'll stop. Anyway, so in 76, there's this fight. And what happens is the election is in November, and this goes on like November, December, January, February. This is going on, and people think they're going back to war. And finally, what happens is there is a guy who is the head of a major railroad company in the United States. His name is Thomas Scott, and he goes to a number of Southern businessmen, and he says, "Listen, if you will support Hayes in the White House." Putting Hayes into the White House, we will make sure that you get funding for Southern railroads, which the South desperately needed because all their railroads have been torn up and a lot of them had gone into bankruptcy after the war and it was a mess. We'll make sure you get Southern Railroads. And we'll make sure you get a cabinet appointment. And people forget about that cabinet appointment. It's David Key, becomes Postmaster General. And that's actually really important because he gets to put in his own people all over the American South in post offices, and they're going to be able to make sure that Democratic literature gets to all the Democratic voters in the South, which the Republicans hadn't been doing. People forget about him, and that's actually quite important. But so if you do that, and let us inaugurate Hayes, then I'll make sure you get all the stuff. And Tom Scott is like a really important dude. He's really rich. He runs the railroads and the whole thing. I wanted to write a biography once of Tom Scott, and somebody was like, yeah, 3 people will read it. But I actually thought he was really interesting. Anyway, that's the deal is cut in February. Hayes is inaugurated on March 4th, which was our inauguration day until FDR. And everything's hunky-dory, right? Except there's a big fight. And although the Southerners get David Key, they don't get the investment in the South that they were promised, essentially. So then a huge fight we're in 77 now, right? Huge fight in the summer of 77, and a major national strike breaks out on Tom Scott's railroad. And what happens? Rutherford B. Hayes sends in the troops, sends in the army. And there's a strike and there's a lot of damage in a lot of places, some caused by one side, some caused by another. But what the American people saw was a government that had been taken over by a businessman. He had his guy in the White House, and the White House then used the American military against the American people to defend Tom Scott's interests. And the Democrats sweep the Congress, and they're going to elect Rutherford B. Hayes in 84. But what Americans saw was the corruption of the American government by big business, and said, we're not going to do that. And so Congress passes the Posse Comitatus Act, which says the president cannot use the troops against the American people, because this is what they were afraid of. Now, if you can't look at that in terms of our government and say they were prescient, you miss the whole point of that story. So the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court said Posse Comitatus in this moment is a really big deal. And in that decision, there's the court split 6-3, but 5 justices all agreed, 3 justices dissented. Brett Kavanaugh wrote his own assent, his own concurrence in the majority decision. And in that, there's a footnote. And in that footnote, he backs away from what have been called Kavanaugh stops. Remember he said, it's okay if they stop people just based on what they look like, because they'll just ask them a few questions and then the people can go. And we literally right now have a person who is in custody, who has a birth certificate and so on, and the government is saying, no, it's a fake. And people are outraged at the attacks on U.S. citizens and on people who are here illegally, to the point that even Brett Kavanaugh is trying to put, hey, wait a minute, Fourth Amendment here in this footnote. So the whole point of where I was going with any of this is that increasingly it seems like the fantasy world that Trump is trying to construct and convince us of, based on 40 years of U.S. Republican rhetoric, is under attack by reality. And even people like the Supreme Court are starting to recognize that this ain't going to work. So at the end of the day, when I look at where we are today, I am watching, I hate to say this, but it feels like I am watching the end of a television show that just went on too long. The writers got lazy, people got bored, and now what we're going to have to do is fix all the crap that we didn't do because we were watching television all the time. And I will write more about that in days to come. But tonight, and the next night and the next night, barring some huge deal, I am not going to write about Donald Trump. I'm just not. It is time for us to take our brains back. And completely by chance, I tumbled onto a really interesting story the other day that is very important for today, and that's tonight's letter. And then we'll see where we go from there. But I will, as I say, try and do something for you on Thursday. But if you can think about things this way and stop, like I woke up this morning and I looked at at all the news in my feed, which I will continue to monitor, by the way. I'm not actually going to take a break. And I just thought, what happened to the days when in late December you watched The Grinch, or you read A Christmas Carol, or you hung out with friends without thinking about the latest lunatic thing that was coming out of Washington? And I thought, you know what? Maybe I'm contributing to that too. And I need to give people a little bit of space where I'll do these talks and you can keep up if you want. But otherwise, you know what? Read a novel, write to your sister, see if you can take a break just for a few days from the craziness, because one of the things we're going to have to do in 2024 is we got to take this country back. And we will not take this country back if the MAGA Republicans are the ones who continue to dominate the way we think about this country. One of the things about breaking out of that false world is recognizing that we get to create the world that we want. And, one of my absolute favorite poems is about the woman in the Garden of Eden, who is, of course, accused of ruining everything for the man and of eating the forbidden fruit. And the final line of it, and maybe again, if I do expound on this on Thursday, the final line of it is that I wasn't expelled, I leaped. And when you think about what we can do going forward, if we seize this moment ourselves and stop reacting to the craziness that Trump is doing, we can leap too. All right, the usual, do everything that you do to keep yourself and this country on track. I will talk to you again soon. I haven't actually even looked at my calendar, so I don't know what's happening for the next several days. But for those of you who celebrate Christmas, I hope you have a great one. For those of you who don't, I also hope you have a number of great days. And for those of you for whom this is the hardest time of year, and I know so many of you who have lost people, and certainly all of us have been there, we see you. And you do whatever it takes to get through the next several days, and I will try to be helpful on that front as well. As usual, thank you all for being here, and I will talk to you again soon.